I want to welcome you into this moment, wherever you are, however your day has been, however your mind feels right now. You might be sitting at a desk with your headphones on, walking along a noisy street, riding a bus, or lying quietly in your room with the lights dim. Wherever you are, I invite you to arrive fully, not perfectly, just gently. Today, I want to talk about something many of us carry in silence, something that sits quietly in our chest during meetings, in our throat when our manager speaks, in our mind when we are surrounded by confident voices. Today, I want to talk about being afraid to ask questions at work. I remember a morning not so long ago when I walked into a classroom that did not belong to me. I was not the teacher that day. I was there as an observer, invited to watch another English teacher lead a lesson. The room smelled like coffee and whiteboard markers. The windows were slightly open, letting in the soft sound of traffic and distant conversation. The students were adults, professionals from different countries, sitting carefully, notebooks open, pens ready. On the surface, everything looked calm, but I could feel something heavier in the air, a quiet tension that I recognized immediately because it lived inside me too. At one point, the teacher explained a new concept. She spoke clearly, confidently, and quickly, writing phrases on the board that seemed simple to her, but not to everyone in the room. I watched one student in particular. He sat near the back, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the board. His pen hovered above his notebook, but he did not write. His jaw tightened, then relaxed, then tightened again. I could almost hear his thoughts without him saying a word. I do not understand. Should I ask? What if my question sounds stupid? What if everyone notices that I am behind? What if the teacher thinks I am not capable? After a few minutes, the teacher moved on to another topic. The student exhaled quietly, almost in relief, but his confusion did not disappear. It simply settled deeper. Later, during a group activity, he struggled to explain his ideas in English. His voice was low, uncertain, and apologetic. When his partner asked him if he had any questions, he smiled politely and said, "I'm fine," even though his eyes told a different story. In that moment, I saw myself reflected in him, and I felt a familiar ache. I think back to my own early days as a teacher, when I was still new, still insecure, still learning how to belong in professional spaces. There was a time when I worked in a large language school with long fluorescent lights and walls covered in motivational posters. Every Monday, we had staff meetings in a small, windowless room. The table was oval, polished, and always slightly cold to the touch. The director would sit at the head, speaking quickly about schedules, student feedback, and new teaching policies. Around the table, my colleagues nodded, scribbled notes, and occasionally asked sharp, confident questions. I would sit somewhere near the middle, my hands wrapped around my mug of tea, pretending to look calm. Inside, my mind was racing. I had so many questions. Why are we changing this method? How should I handle a student who struggles with speaking? What does this new policy really mean in practice? But every time I opened my mouth, fear tightened around my voice like a quiet hand. I worried that my questions would reveal my inexperience, that they would make me look less capable than I wanted to appear. There was one meeting that stayed with me. The director introduced a new assessment system for students. She explained it in technical terms, using words that sounded precise but distant. I did not fully understand how it would work in my classroom. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. My heart beat faster, not because the situation was dangerous, but because my mind was caught between two strong impulses. One part of me wanted to raise my hand and ask for clarity. Another part whispered, "Stay quiet. Don't draw attention to yourself. Figure it out later." I chose silence. The meeting ended. People stood up. Chairs scraped against the floor. Conversations began in small clusters. I walked back to my classroom with a tightness in my chest. For the rest of the week, I felt uneasy every time I thought about the new system. My silence had not protected me. It had only created more stress, more confusion, more distance between me and my work. When I think about these moments now, I notice how much they are not just about language, not just about professionalism, but about something deeper. Being afraid to ask questions at work is rarely only about the question itself. It is about how we see ourselves, how we fear being judged, how we carry past experiences of embarrassment or rejection. I want to return to that student in the classroom I observed. Later, after the lesson, I spoke with him privately. We sat at a small table near the window. The light fell gently across his face. I asked him how he felt during the lesson. He hesitated, then sighed softly. He told me that in his company meetings, especially in English, he often felt invisible. He understood more than people assumed, but less than he wished. Still, he rarely asked questions. In his culture, he explained, asking too many questions could be seen as disrespectful or as a sign of incompetence. At work, he wanted to appear strong, reliable, professional. Asking questions felt like admitting weakness. As he spoke, I listened carefully, not as a teacher correcting a student, but as one human listening to another. I could feel his frustration, his exhaustion, his quiet desire to be understood. I told him something simple. I said, "Asking a question is not a sign that you do not know. It is often a sign that you care enough to understand." There is a phrase in English that I find very powerful in this context. It sounds simple, but it carries a lot of meaning. Could you clarify that for me? These words are gentle, respectful, and honest. They do not say, "I am stupid." They say, "I am paying attention." They say, "I want to be sure." They say, "I am engaged." Another phrase that matters is, "I'm not sure I fully understand." Notice how this is different from, "I don't understand." The first one leaves space. It acknowledges effort, not failure. It invites explanation rather than demanding it. And then there is, "just to make sure I'm clear." This phrase is particularly useful at work. It sounds professional, thoughtful, and collaborative. If you think about these expressions, they are not just language tools. They are ways of positioning yourself in a conversation. They allow you to be curious without feeling exposed. They allow you to be vulnerable in a safe, professional way. When I teach, I often notice how students react to these phrases. At first, they might feel awkward saying them. Their voice might tremble slightly. Their sentences might not be perfectly structured. But slowly, with practice, something shifts. Their posture changes. Their tone becomes steadier. Their eyes meet mine more directly. Language gives them a bridge between fear and confidence. I want to tell you another story, this time about a young woman I once taught. Her name was Lynn. She worked in a marketing company where most meetings were conducted in English. She was intelligent, creative, and hardworking, but deeply self-critical. In every class, she spoke beautifully when prepared, but froze when asked spontaneous questions. One day, she came to class looking unusually tired. Her shoulders were tense, her smile faint. When I asked how her week had been, she looked down and admitted that she had felt embarrassed at work. During a meeting with international clients, her manager had asked her if she had any questions. In front of everyone, she had said no, even though she was confused about several points. Later, when she tried to complete her tasks, she realized she had misunderstood key details. The mistake cost her extra hours of work and a difficult conversation with her boss. As she told me this, her voice cracked slightly. She was not just upset about the mistake. She was upset with herself for staying silent. In that moment, we did not focus on grammar or vocabulary. We focused on how fear moves through the body, how it can make our voice small, our thoughts scattered, our breath shallow. I asked her to imagine a different version of that meeting. Not a perfect version, just a slightly braver one. In this imagined scene, she takes a breath, feels her heartbeat, and says calmly, "Just to make sure I'm clear, could you explain that part again?" I described how her colleagues might respond. Some might nod, appreciating her clarity. Others might listen more carefully themselves. Her manager might see her not as someone who does not know, but as someone who cares about doing things right. As we spoke, I saw something soften in her expression. It was not dramatic. It was subtle, like a cloud moving away from the sun. She realized that asking questions was not only about avoiding mistakes. It was about giving herself permission to be human in a professional space. Sometimes, when I think about fear in the workplace, I imagine it as a quiet room inside us. The walls are lined with old memories. A teacher who once laughed at our mistake. A manager who once responded impatiently. A colleague who rolled their eyes when we spoke too slowly in English. All of these experiences sit there, shaping how we behave, often without us noticing. But there is also another room inside us, a quieter, wiser space. In that room, we understand that learning is not linear, that no one knows everything, that asking questions is how knowledge grows. When we choose to speak from that room, even softly, something shifts in how we carry ourselves. At work, many people wear a mask of certainty. They speak quickly, use technical language, and rarely admit confusion. But behind that mask, most of them have moments of doubt. They too have sat in meetings thinking, "I hope someone else asks, because I don't want to." The difference is not intelligence. The difference is how we relate to our fear. When you sit in a meeting and feel that familiar tightening in your chest, notice it. Not in a judgmental way, just gently. Notice your breath. Notice your thoughts. You might think, if I ask, they will think I am incompetent. But ask yourself quietly, is that always true? Or is that a story my fear is telling me? There is something very human about not wanting to look foolish. No one enjoys embarrassment, but there is also something deeply human about curiosity. Every great idea, every meaningful connection, every real understanding begins with a question. I often think about how language learning mirrors this process. When you learn English, you make mistakes. You mispronounce words. You forget grammar. You struggle to find the right expression. If you let fear control you, you stay silent, and your English does not grow. But if you allow yourself to ask, to try, to stumble and continue, your voice slowly becomes stronger. Work is not so different. When you ask a question, you are not just seeking information. You are practicing courage. You are practicing presence. You are practicing your right to take up space, even if that space feels uncomfortable at first. I remember another moment from my own career. Years later, after many meetings, many mistakes, and many small acts of bravery, I found myself in a workshop with experienced educators from around the world. The facilitator presented a complex model of language acquisition. As she spoke, I felt that familiar flutter of uncertainty. Old habits tried to pull me back into silence. But this time, I paused. I breathed. I noticed the fear without letting it lead. Then I raised my hand and said, "Could you clarify how this model applies to adult learners with limited exposure to English outside the classroom?" My voice was steady. Not perfect, but honest. The facilitator smiled and gave a thoughtful explanation. Several other teachers nodded, clearly grateful that I had asked. In that moment, I realized something important. Asking a question does not make you smaller. It often makes the room more open. It invites dialogue. It creates space for others who might feel the same way, but are too afraid to speak. For you, listening right now, your workplace might be very different from mine. You might work in an office, a hospital, a factory, a school, a cafe, or online from your home. But the feeling is likely familiar. That quiet hesitation before speaking, that inner voice saying, "Don't risk it." I want you to imagine yourself in one of those moments. You're sitting in a meeting. People are talking. English words move around you like waves. You feel slightly lost, slightly tense, slightly small. Instead of judging yourself, simply notice that feeling. Then imagine saying, "I'm not sure I fully understand this part. Could you explain it again?" Imagine your voice calm, not rushed, not apologetic. How does that feel? Perhaps a little scary, but also a little relieving, like setting down a heavy bag you have been carrying for too long. I think sometimes we believe that confident people never feel afraid, but that is not true. Confidence is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to act gently despite it. Asking a question at work is one of those small, powerful acts of confidence. There is also something beautiful about the way questions connect people. When you ask thoughtfully, you invite others into your thinking. You create a bridge between your mind and theirs. You show that you are engaged, that you care, that you are present. In English, we often talk about softening our questions. Instead of bluntly saying, "Explain this," we say, "Could you help me understand?" Instead of demanding clarity, we say, "I would appreciate your perspective." These are not just polite phrases. They are expressions of respect, both for the other person and for yourself. I want to share one more image with you. Picture yourself at work, not as the person who knows everything, but as the person who is willing to learn. Picture yourself not shrinking into your chair, but sitting a little taller, breathing a little slower, speaking a little more clearly. You are not loud. You are not confrontational. You are simply honest. Maybe one day, someone else in that room will look at you and feel less alone because you asked what they were too afraid to ask. Maybe your question will spark a better discussion, a clearer plan, a more thoughtful decision. Maybe, over time, you will notice that your fear begins to loosen its grip. When I reflect on all of this, I see how deeply connected language and life are. When we talk about asking questions, we are not just practicing English. We are practicing trust, trust in ourselves, trust that we are allowed to be imperfect, trust that growth happens through curiosity, not silence. Sometimes I feel sad when I think about How many people remain quiet at work, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are afraid to be seen. I imagine all the unspoken ideas, the hidden insights, the quiet intelligence that never reaches the surface. And I think how much richer our workplaces, our conversations, and our lives could be if we felt safer asking. Maybe you have felt this too. Maybe you have sat in a meeting, heart racing, words stuck in your throat. Maybe you have gone home afterward, replaying the moment, wishing you had spoken. If that is you, I want you to be gentle with yourself. Fear does not make you weak. It makes you human. The next time you find yourself in that situation, you do not need to be perfect. You do not need to deliver a brilliant question. You can simply begin with something small. Just to make sure I'm clear, could you clarify that for me? I'm not sure I fully understand this part. Let those words be like a soft opening, not a dramatic performance. Let your voice carry not only information, but your presence, your curiosity, your willingness to grow. Because in the end, you are not just learning English. You are learning how to show up in your own life, how to take up space with kindness, how to speak even when your heart trembles a little. I also remember a quiet afternoon in a co-working space, long after my teaching day had finished. Rain was sliding slowly down the glass walls, blurring the city into soft lines of light and movement. People around me were typing, speaking in low voices, moving between phone calls and laptops. I sat with my notebook open, trying to plan a new course, but my mind kept drifting back to conversations I had heard earlier that week. At the table beside me, two young professionals were discussing a project in English. One of them spoke with great fluency, confident, smooth, almost effortless. The other listened carefully, nodding, but I could see a slight tension in her shoulders. At one point, the confident speaker used a technical phrase that was clearly unfamiliar to her. For a brief second, she hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward her notebook, then back to her colleague. I watched her inhale, then exhale, and then, very gently, she said, "Sorry, could you explain what you mean by that?" Her voice was not shaky. It was calm, steady, respectful. The other person did not seem annoyed. Instead, they leaned forward slightly and explained the term in simpler words. The conversation continued smoothly. No drama, no embarrassment, just communication. I realized in that moment how powerful such a small act could be. Asking a question did not interrupt the flow of their work. It strengthened it. It brought clarity. It created alignment. And I thought about how many people in similar situations would have stayed silent, pretending to understand, carrying confusion quietly inside. There is something interesting about silence at work. Sometimes silence is wise. Sometimes it is thoughtful, reflective, strategic. But sometimes silence is heavy. It sits in your chest like a stone. It makes your thoughts circle without direction. It separates you from others, even when you are physically sitting right beside them. When you are working in a second language, that silence can feel even heavier. English can feel like a wall instead of a bridge. Words that should connect you instead make you feel exposed, vulnerable, slightly out of place. You might think, if I speak too much, they will hear my accent. If I ask, they will notice my hesitation. If I struggle, they will see me as less professional. I want to invite you to look at this from another angle. Your accent, your hesitation, your careful way of speaking are not flaws. They are signs of someone who is operating in more than one world, more than one language, more than one way of thinking. That is not weakness. That is complexity. That is effort. That is intelligence. There is another phrase I often share with my students that can be very useful at work. I just want to check my understanding. It sounds simple, but it carries a respectful tone. It shows that you are trying, that you are engaged, that you care about accuracy. You are not challenging anyone. You are collaborating. Imagine using that phrase in a meeting. You say, "I just want to check my understanding." Are we saying that? And then you restate the idea in your own words. This does two things at once. It gives you clarity, and it shows others that you are actively processing information. Many managers actually appreciate this more than silent agreement. I think about a young engineer I once met during a language workshop for professionals. His name was Min. Brilliant, analytical, deeply thoughtful. In technical discussions, he understood complex concepts quickly, but in English meetings he rarely spoke, not because he lacked ideas, but because he feared being misunderstood. He told me that once, during a project review, he had an important concern about a design flaw. He saw it clearly in his mind, but struggled to explain it in English. Instead of asking for help to express it, he stayed quiet. Weeks later, the issue became a real problem, costing the team time and resources. When his manager later asked why he had not raised it earlier, Min felt both frustrated and ashamed. In our conversation, he did not need grammar correction. He needed permission. Permission to be imperfect in English while still being brilliant in his field. Permission to say, "I'm having trouble explaining this in English, but I think there is a problem here." Permission to ask, "Could you help me find the right words?" Workplaces often reward certainty, speed, and polish, but real progress often comes from slower, messier, more honest communication. Questions are part of that process. They slow things down just enough to make them clearer. I sometimes imagine fear as a teacher sitting beside you in a meeting, whispering in your ear. It says things like, "Don't speak, you will sound foolish. Wait until later, someone else will ask." But there is another voice too, quieter but steadier. It says, "Your perspective matters. Your understanding is important. You deserve clarity." Learning to listen to that second voice is not easy. It takes practice, patience, and self-compassion. But every time you ask a small question, you strengthen it a little. Language can help you with this. The way you phrase your question can make the act feel safer. Instead of, "I don't get this," you can say, "I might be missing something here." Instead of, "That makes no sense," you can say, "I'm a bit confused about this part." These are not tricks. They are ways of communicating your humanity while maintaining professionalism. I also want to acknowledge something important. Sometimes, the fear of asking questions is not only internal. Some workplaces truly discourage questions. Some managers are impatient. Some cultures value silence more than inquiry. If that is your reality, your challenge is more complex. You are not wrong for feeling hesitant. In those environments, you might need to choose your moments carefully. You might ask questions privately instead of publicly. You might send a thoughtful email instead of speaking in a meeting. But even then, the core idea remains. Your understanding matters. Your voice matters. Your learning matters. I often tell my students that asking a question is an act of respect. Respect for the work, respect for others, and respect for yourself. You are saying, This matters enough for me to want clarity. When I reflect on my own journey, I see how much my relationship with questions has changed. Early in my career, I saw questions as risks. Now, I see them as tools. They help me learn, connect, and grow. They remind me that I do not have to carry everything alone. Sometimes I feel a gentle sadness when I imagine how many people sit through long workdays filled with unspoken confusion, unshared ideas, and quiet anxiety. But I also feel hope when I think about how a single question, asked with courage and care, can shift that atmosphere even slightly. Maybe you are listening to this after a difficult day at work. Maybe you replayed a meeting in your head, wishing you had spoken. Maybe you feel tired of holding back. If so, I want you to imagine tomorrow, or your next meeting, as a small experiment rather than a test. You do not have to be perfect. You do not have to ask something brilliant. You can simply try one gentle phrase. Could you clarify that for me, or just to make sure I'm clear? Or I'm not sure I fully understand this part. Notice how your body feels when you say it. Notice your breath. Notice that the world does not collapse. Notice that, more often than not, people respond with patience. And even if someone responds less kindly, remember this. Their reaction says more about them than about you. Your willingness to ask still shows courage. Because in the end, learning English at work is not only about grammar, vocabulary, or pronunciation. It is about learning how to show up as yourself in another language, in another culture, in another professional space. It is about finding your voice, not by shouting, but by speaking honestly, even when your heart trembles a little. I think about all the quiet questions that have shaped my life, questions that led me to new books, new ideas, new conversations, new relationships, questions that made me a better teacher, a more thoughtful person, a more compassionate listener. Your questions, too, have that power. They are not interruptions. They are openings. They are bridges. They are small acts of trust in yourself, in others, and in the process of learning. I think, too, about how questions live inside us long before they ever reach our lips. They begin as quiet sparks, a slight confusion, a gentle curiosity, a small feeling that something is not quite clear. At work, we often learn to ignore those sparks because everything feels rushed, efficient, structured. Meetings have agendas. Deadlines are tight. People speak quickly. There is an unspoken pressure to keep up, to nod, to move forward. But if you slow down for a moment, even now as you listen, you can notice how your mind naturally asks questions all the time. Why did that person say it that way? What does this new policy really mean? How will this decision affect my work? That questioning instinct is not a weakness. It is how your intelligence functions. It is how you understand the world. I remember a rainy evening when I was helping a student prepare for an important presentation at work. We sat in a small cafe, the kind with warm wooden tables and soft background music. Outside, the street glistened under the streetlights. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and baked bread. My student, a quiet but capable woman named Hannah, kept pausing in the middle of her sentences. Every time she stumbled over a word or hesitated, she apologized immediately. Sorry, sorry, sorry. It became almost automatic. I stopped her gently and asked, "Why do you keep apologizing?" She looked surprised, as if she had not even noticed she was doing it. She told me that in meetings, she felt like she was taking up too much space whenever she spoke in English. She worried that her accent, her pauses, her questions were a burden to others. So she apologized before anyone could criticize her. We sat there for a moment in silence, listening to the rain tap against the window. Then I asked her to try something different. Instead of apologizing, I asked her to use a small but powerful phrase, "Thank you for your patience." It carries a very different energy. It does not shrink you. It positions you as someone who is thoughtful, respectful, and still worthy of being heard. We practiced together. She said slowly, "Thank you for your patience. I just want to check my understanding." Her voice trembled slightly at first, but then steadied. I could see her posture shift, just a little. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath became deeper. In that moment, I realized how much language shapes not only how others see us, but how we see ourselves. The right words can gently lift you instead of pushing you down. At work, you might also struggle with another layer of fear, the fear of being seen as too slow. Especially in English, you might need more time to process, to translate, to form your thoughts. But speed is not the same as intelligence. Taking a moment before speaking is not a flaw. It is presence. There is a phrase I often recommend in meetings. Let me think about that for a moment. It sounds professional, calm, and grounded. It gives you space. It shows that you are not reacting automatically, but considering carefully. Imagine saying that when someone asks you a complex question, instead of panicking, you breathe and say, "Let me think about that for a moment." In that pause, you reclaim your power. You are not at the mercy of fear. You are choosing your response. I want to share another memory, this one from early in my teaching career. I was leading a workshop for international professionals about communication in English. One man in the group, a senior manager from Japan, raised his hand and asked something that surprised me. He said, "Thomas, how do I ask questions without looking weak?" It was such an honest, vulnerable question from someone in a position of authority. The room grew quiet. Everyone leaned in. I paused, feeling the weight of his concern. I told him that asking questions does not make a leader weak. In fact, it often makes them stronger. When a leader asks thoughtful questions, they create psychological safety. They signal to others that it is okay not to know everything. They encourage openness, collaboration, and deeper thinking. I gave him a few phrases he could use as a manager. What am I missing here? How do you see this? Can you help me understand your perspective? These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of wisdom. After the workshop, several other participants came up to me privately and said that they had been carrying the same fear for years, but had never dared to voice it. In that moment, I saw how universal this struggle is, across cultures, across professions, across personalities. Sometimes, when you are afraid to ask questions at work, it is not only about you, it is about the environment you are in. But your choice to ask, even once, can gently change that environment, even if only a little. I often imagine workplaces as living ecosystem. Every voice, every silence, every question, every reaction shapes the atmosphere. When you choose to speak with clarity and kindness, you contribute to a culture where learning is valued more than perfection. There is also something deeply personal about asking questions in another language. It requires you to be vulnerable in two ways, intellectually and linguistically. You are not only revealing that you do not know something, You are doing so in a language that may still feel foreign to you. That takes courage. I want you to think about your own journey with English. Perhaps there were times when you were afraid to speak in class, afraid to make mistakes, afraid to sound different. And yet, you kept going. You practiced. You listened. You tried again. That same resilience can live in your workplace too. There is a quiet power in small beginnings. You do not need to become the most outspoken person in the room overnight. You can start with one gentle question in one meeting, then another, then another. Over time, your fear will not disappear completely, but it will lose some of its strength. I sometimes tell my students to treat their fear like a passenger in the car, not the driver. You acknowledge it, but you do not let it control the direction. You keep your hands on the wheel. Language can be your ally in this. Phrases like, "Could you clarify that for me? I just want to check my understanding. I might be mistaken, but," or "I'm not sure I fully understand this part," are like steady bridges over the river of fear. As you listen to this, I want you to imagine yourself in your next meeting. Feel the room, the table, the voices. Feel your heartbeat. Then imagine your voice, calm and clear, saying one of those phrases. Notice that nothing terrible happens. Notice that you are still there, still respected, still capable. Maybe someone nods. Maybe they explain. Maybe the conversation becomes clearer for everyone. And if no one responds perfectly, remember that your worth does not depend on their reaction. Your act of speaking is already a step toward growth. I think sometimes we forget that work is not just about tasks, productivity, and results. It is also a deeply human space where we bring our hopes, our insecurities, our strengths, and our fears. Asking questions is one of the ways we navigate that space with honesty. When I look back at my own life, I see how many doors opened because I chose to ask instead of staying silent. A conversation that led to a job, a clarification that prevented a misunderstanding, a simple question that deepened a relationship. Your questions have that same potential. Maybe you have felt small at work. Maybe you have felt invisible. Maybe you have felt like your English is never quite enough. If so, I want you to hear this clearly. Your voice matters. Your understanding matters. Your presence matters. And every time you ask a question, gently, respectfully, honestly, you are not only practicing English, you are practicing self-respect. Sometimes I feel, in quiet moments, that language learning is really about learning how to be kinder to ourselves, how to speak not only with others, but with our own inner voice, how to replace harsh self-judgment with curiosity. So the next time you feel afraid to ask, notice that feeling, breathe with it. Then, with as much gentleness as you can, let your words move forward anyway. Because growth does not come from silence. It comes from speaking, even when your heart trembles a little. And perhaps, long after this meeting, long after this day, long after this moment of listening, you will remember not the exact words, but the feeling, that quiet shift from shrinking to standing, from silence to gentle speech, from fear to careful courage. You might not notice it immediately. Growth rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, in small choices, in the way you breathe before you speak, in the way you let a question leave your mouth even when your heart is uncertain, in the way you no longer apologize for existing in English, but simply show up and try. There will still be days when you hesitate. There will still be meetings where your voice feels small. There will still be moments when fear sits close beside you. That is not failure. That is being human. What matters is not perfection, but practice. Not loud confidence, but steady presence. Not knowing everything, but being willing to learn. And every time you ask, even softly, you are reminding yourself that you belong in that room, in that conversation, in that language, in that work, in that life. Because you are not just someone trying to survive in English at work. You are someone growing through it, shaping your voice through it, becoming more yourself through it. This is English with Thomas. I'm Thomas. Keep speaking, keep growing, and keep trusting yourself.